The story of massacre and persecution would be repeated in other regions of the Southern Ocean. For 500 years, the world of the Southern Ocean would be shaped by the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British. They, in turn, would be influenced by the many ethnic communities of the region, most of all, the Chinese. The Portuguese held Malacca for just a short time. It was a new power that seized this jewel of Asia, the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch chose not Malacca, but Batavia as their colonial capital on the island of Java. Today, Batavia is the modern Indonesian capital, Jakarta.
And the interesting thing is, once the Westerners settled down there, that then also Chinese settlements emerged, often very close to the Western settlements, often together, like in the case of Batavia, for instance.
Dutch records, as well as paintings in the famous Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, provide fascinating insights into the interaction between the Dutch and the Chinese. The Dutch recognized the importance of making allies of the Chinese. In 1620, a Dutch governor told his colleagues,
"Whoever seeks to establish and expand Dutch dominion must work with the Chinese, for they are the most resilient, frugal, skilled, hard-working and disciplined people."
Western countries, European countries, they promoted overseas trade, while in the eyes of the Chinese government, the Chinese who went overseas really were pantuja. They were bandits.
In the 17th century, 1,000 Chinese helped build the infrastructure of Colonia Batavia. They built many houses and mansions and straightened rivers. They excavated a network of canals.
When the Chinese came at the same time as the Dutch people, they were either invited by the Dutch people as laborers, as carpenters, as house builders. There were not enough Dutch people in Batavia to do the job. The people who would go to Batavia at that time were just soldiers who could build a small fortress of wood, and there were some merchants who could trade. There were no other, let's call it middle-class people or laborers. So he needed the laborers to build the city, to build walls around the city, and that was a big job.
In modern Jakarta, land reclamation and construction have obscured the Chinese contribution to the city development. Today we can see just this single canal, built long ago by Chinese workers. Outside the city, Chinese farmers created a lucrative sugar industry, which transformed the Netherlands into the biggest sugar supplier in the world. For a brief period, the grateful Dutch supported Chinese hospitals and orphanages.
What makes Batavia case so interesting is that from the beginning to the end, the Dutch administration tried to reach some kind of cooperation with the Chinese population.
But this harmony between Dutch and Chinese in the East Indies did not last. The rapid expansion of the city led to epidemics of malaria, and the Dutch blamed the Chinese. A Dutch employee wrote to his family despairingly that Batavia is an extremely unhealthy place. People here look like living death. A man you see today may die on the second day. I've witnessed things as such twice, and it's only 2 weeks after I landed. Then an economic downturn followed in the wake of disease. Misfortune was laid at Chinese doors.
At that time, sugar was also cultivated in Brazil. And the market for sugar in Europe had enough sugar from Brazil. Less sugar was needed from Indonesia. So there was less work, so a lot of the Chinese laborers who worked in the sugar plantations became unemployed.
In October 1740, once again during the Mid-Autumn Festival, Chinese and Dutch militias clash near Jakarta.
This resulted in a very tragical event where the Dutch started to attack and eventually murder between 5,000 to 10,000 Chinese people within the city walls.
将近1万个华人，那也就是说，在巴达维亚城区的华人，可能80%都被杀了。所谓的红溪惨案呢，就是因为当时罹难的华人的尸体被扔到河里面，那血把这个红溪水都染红了。当时这个红溪，到今天。 现在那条河现在还在。
好没天良的公办呀！近来他们刮钱刮疯了，强迫咱们8成的唐人一次又一次的换新的居留字。居留字我们早就做过，人头税我们有钱也照交，可我们就是没有钱，被他们一次再一次疯狂的勒索。
就是，要我说，就是有钱也不能给他们。
对，有钱也不能给他们。
不能给。
要是再逼迫咱们的，咱们都造反。这总比让他们骑在咱们头上拉屎强吧？
这个时候就差一棵稻草，荷兰兵就挨家挨户要搜查、要抓人、找钱，那么华人就开始反抗。反抗呢，那么那个谣言这个时候就起来了，荷兰人要屠杀所有的华人。 那么我们不反抗，可能是死路一条。
他紧张了，他紧张的看着华人可能有反抗的这个趋势，他先下手为强。
As European empire builders tightened their grip on Southeast Asia, the old Chinese empire entered a long period of decline that would not be reversed until the 20th century.
地方那种科技发展、工业革命，跟这个海上贸易，等于整个世界的全部的沿海的生意贸易都给它占领了，都给它控制了。那因此他们这种发展的势力之快。 那中国就无法比了。
The weakening of the Chinese empire in a highly competitive globalized economy led to a new tide of migrants seeking a new life in the southern oceans. Many of the Chinese were poor, even desperate. They would now become virtual slaves. The reduced and increasingly abject status of the new wave of Chinese migrants is demonstrated here at St. John's Island, which used to be the biggest quarantine station in the world. This was the entry point for hundreds of thousands of Chinese laborers who were collectively known as pigs.
我小时候，我4、5岁从汕头坐船来新加坡，当时我们在汕头也是有打预防针的。 但是那个时候，我们的国家的没有这样好的卫生条件，英政府新加坡是英政府管的，所以你的防疫针来到新加坡虽然有那个证书，但是他不承认。来到新加坡第1天要上岸的时候，他给你坐小船去圣约翰岛。 在那边，他跟你上岸的时候，首先就是给你打预防针。收船的人都没事了，没有发烧才可以上岸。如果其中有一个发燒嘅，就唔可以上岸。
要消毒過，要驗過豆啦，梗係有時講驗豆嘅，你驗過豆啦。如果你粒豆驗咗唔發咧，有時再驗過嘅喎。有時有啲肉咁啊，俾樣刀咁戒， 咁解咁樣嚟啊！10日嘅時間喺，如果打埋頭夠喺10日咧，喺個山度周圍咁行下咯，咁咯冇嘢做啊。
The people who arrived here had already endured months of suffering packed on ships. Now they would be subjected to a humiliating series of inspections. They would be driven through pools of a sulfur disinfectant. Anyone suffering from a fever would be incarcerated in cells like these. Those who got through were issued with a yellow card, a precious right of entry. For these pigs, the purgatorial world of St. John's Island was just the beginning of a very long ordeal. For the Chinese join a globalized labor force that was propelling the Industrial Revolution in faraway Europe. This revolution needed raw materials like tin that would be sucked out of the jungles of Southeast Asia by Chinese laborers. At this stage, the majority of Chinese migrants were men who had left their families behind. They were lonely and often desperate. The new migrants gravitated to a harsh new world that was being carved from the jungle, the world of the tin mine. Today in Indonesia, we can get a glimpse of what this was like hundreds of years ago.
那个时候锡矿啊是很重要的工业原料，而整个世界那个锡矿就产在马来亚跟那个印度尼西亚这个地方。
This is Bangka. Tin is still mined here, but in ever-decreasing quantities after centuries of extraction. The mines are just 10 degrees north of the equator. At noon, the sun beats down without mercy. It is not difficult to imagine that only the toughest could survive here. These mines become a mecca for new arrivals, desperate to make a living. Over the next centuries, Southeast Asia becomes a vast labor camp.